The mist clung to everything like memory itself, grey, shifting, impossible to grasp. Elias opened his eyes to find himself lying beside a road that stretched beyond sight in both directions, its ancient stones worn smooth by countless footsteps that had never quite erased the mystery of where they led. The air tasted of rain that had never fallen and salt from seas that might not exist. He sat up slowly, his joints protesting as if he had been sleeping for decades rather than hours, or had it been hours. Time felt negotiable here, malleable as the fog that drifted across the barren landscape. His clothes were travel-worn but intact, his boots scuffed but serviceable. In his pocket his fingers found a compass, brass and warm to the touch, as if it had been resting against skin for centuries. He pulled it out and watched the needle dance. It spun without purpose, pointing everywhere and nowhere, a drunk prophet offering directions to lands that existed only in the space between heartbeats. North meant nothing here. Perhaps it had never meant anything anywhere. Standing, Elias felt the weight of absence in his chest. Not grief, exactly, but the hollow ache of something essential that had been carved away. His memories were fragments. The smell of bread baking, the sound of rain on a tin roof, a woman's laugh that might have been meant for him. But they floated disconnected, orphaned moments that refused to coalesce into a life he could claim as his own. The road called to him with the voice of worn stone and patient time. He chose a direction, left, though left and right seemed equally arbitrary, and began to walk. His footsteps echoed strangely, as if the sound were being stretched across impossible distances. The landscape on either side remained stubbornly the same, rolling hills covered in silver grass that moved without wind, stunted trees whose branches reached toward a sun that cast no shadows. It was beautiful in the way that dreams are beautiful. Too perfect to be real, too strange to be entirely false. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes expanded to fill the space where hours should have been. The road never changed, never curved, never offered the promise of arrival. Elias found this oddly comforting. In a world where memories were unreliable and direction was meaningless, at least the road was honest about its nature. It went nowhere and everywhere, and it didn't pretend otherwise. The first sign of another presence came as a glint of reflected light ahead, fracturing the mist into rainbow shards. As Elias drew closer, the light resolved into mirrors, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, arranged in careful rows on both sides of the road. They were all different sizes and shapes, tall standing mirrors that could reflect a person's full height, compact hand mirrors that captured only faces, curved mirrors that distorted reality into funhouse shapes, and ancient mirrors whose silver had tarnished into cloudy suggestions of reflection. Behind the collection sat an old woman on a three-legged stool, her white hair braided with ribbons that might once have been colourful, but had faded to the grey of everything else in this place. Her hands were folded in her lap, and she watched Elias approach with the patient interest of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment, for exactly as long as it had taken him to arrive. "Looking for something, dearie?" Her voice carried the crackle of autumn leaves. "Everyone who walks this road is looking for something. The lucky ones know what it is." Elias stopped before the nearest mirror, a simple rectangular piece framed in dark wood. His reflection looked back at him, but something was wrong. The face was his, the clothes were his, but the expression belonged to someone else, someone younger, laughing at a joke he couldn't hear. Behind his reflected self he could see a kitchen with yellow walls and morning light streaming through gingham curtains. A woman stood at the stove, her back turned, but he knew without seeing her face that she was humming. "That's not me," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Isn't it?" The old woman rose from her stool with the careful precision of someone whose bones remembered better days. "My mirrors don't show you as you are, love. They show you as you've been, moments from your life, caught like butterflies in glass." Elias moved to another mirror, this one oval and ornate. Here his reflection was older, wearing clothes he didn't recognise, standing in what appeared to be a library. Books surrounded him floor to ceiling, and he was pulling one from a shelf with the careful reverence of someone handling something sacred. The reflected Elias looked content in a way that felt foreign to the Elias who stood in the road. "I don't remember any of this," he said. "Memory is a poor keeper of truth," the woman replied, running her finger along the frame of a particularly small mirror. "It edits, it embellishes, It discards what doesn't fit the story we tell ourselves. But moments are honest. They just are. Mirror after mirror showed him scenes that felt like borrowed dreams. Elias as a child, building something intricate with wooden blocks while an unseen adult offered encouragement. Elias as a young man, walking through a field of sunflowers with dirt under his fingernails and satisfaction in his stride. Elias in middle age, sitting beside a hospital bed, holding a hand that belonged to someone whose face the mirror wouldn't reveal. "Are these real?" he asked. "What makes something real?" the woman countered. "The fact that it happened? Or the fact that it could have happened? The fact that you remember it? Or the fact that it remembers you?" Frustration built in Elias's chest like steam in a kettle. The mirrors offered him pieces of himself, but they were pieces of a puzzle whose picture he couldn't see. They were beautiful and heartbreaking and utterly foreign. If these were his moments, where were the connections between them? Where was the thread that wove them into a life? He approached the largest mirror, one that stood nearly as tall as he did, framed in silver that had gone black with age. This reflection showed him something different. Not a moment from his past, but himself, as he stood now, beside the road, looking into mirrors. But in the reflection, he was smiling, not with happiness, but with understanding. And behind him, instead of the endless road, stretched a landscape of impossible beauty. Mountains that sang with crystalline voices, rivers that flowed upward into crystal skies, forests where every leaf was a different season. "That's not real either," he said, but his voice was quiet now, uncertain. "Isn't it?" the woman asked again. "Reality is more generous than we give it credit for. It includes not just what is, but what could be, what should be, what might yet be if we're brave enough to reach for it." Elias stared at his smiling reflection, at the world of wonders that spread behind him like a promise. It was beautiful, yes, but it felt like a lie, or worse, like someone else's truth dressed up in his face. He thought of the compass in his pocket, spinning endlessly because it refused to pretend it knew where north was. "I don't want what could be," he said suddenly. "I don't want what should be. I want what is, even if what is makes no sense." The old woman nodded as if this was exactly the right answer. "Then you understand the first lesson of the road?" But understanding felt hollow, academic. The mirrors surrounded him with their beautiful lies and their alien truths, and he felt more lost than when he had awakened beside the empty road. The compass spun, the memories flickered like candle flames in windows he would never enter, and the road stretched on without explanation or apology. Something snapped inside him, not breaking but releasing, like a spring unwinding after being held taut for too long. He picked up a fist-sized stone from beside the road and hurled it at the nearest mirror. The glass shattered with a sound like bells falling from a great height. The reflected moment, himself as a child, laughing at something just out of frame, exploded into fragments that caught the grey light before falling to the ground like crystalline snow. But in the largest shard he caught a glimpse of something impossible. His own face reflected not once but infinitely, stretching away into mirrors within mirrors within mirrors, each reflection slightly different, each one him but not quite him, all of them shattering simultaneously while somehow remaining whole. He looked down at his hands, expecting to see cuts from the flying glass, but his skin was unmarked. He looked back at the broken mirror and saw that while the glass had shattered, the frame remained intact, and within it, impossibly, his reflection continued to exist. Not the child self that had been there before, but himself as he stood now, whole and wondering and somehow more real for having been broken. "Curious," the old woman said mildly. "Most people expect the shattering to hurt more than it does." Elias left the mirrors behind without buying anything, though he suspected that was exactly what the old woman had expected him to do. The road continued its patient journey toward the horizon, and he walked with it, the compass warm in his pocket and the memory of infinite reflections dancing behind his eyes. The fork appeared gradually, like something rising from deep water. At first it seemed like a trick of the mist, a suggestion of division in the unchanging line of stone. But as Elias drew closer, the split became undeniable. The road divided into two paths of equal width and apparent purpose, each disappearing into its own distant certainty. At the exact point where the road split, two figures sat in perfect stillness. They were identical twins, Or perhaps they were the same person viewed from two different angles of possibility. Both were monks, their heads shaved to gleaming smoothness, their postures radiating the kind of peace that comes from having resolved all questions worth asking. But one wore robes of absolute white that seemed to gather what little light filtered through the mist, while the other was dressed in black so deep it appeared to absorb illumination rather than reflect it. They sat facing each other across the fork, close enough to reach out and touch, but neither moved. Their eyes were closed, their breathing synchronized, as if they shared not just appearance but breath itself. Yet something in the set of their shoulders suggested fundamental disagreement, a tension that ran deeper than flesh and bone. Elias approached cautiously, the way one might approach a sleeping animal whose dreams could turn violent without warning. The compass in his pocket grew warm, almost hot, and when he pulled it out he saw that the needle had stopped its endless spinning. Instead it vibrated rapidly between the two paths, unable to choose but equally unable to rest. The monk in white opened his eyes first. They were pale grey like winter sky, and when they focused on Elias they carried the weight of infinite patience. "Traveller," he said, his voice carrying the resonance of temple bells. "You have reached the crossing of purposes. I am Brother Destiny, keeper of the left path. The road you seek lies in the direction I guard." Before Elias could respond, the monk in black opened his own eyes, deep brown, warm as summer earth, equally patient but somehow more urgent. "Traveller," he said, and his voice was the sound of wind through autumn leaves. "I am Brother Freedom, and I tell you truly, the path you need is the one I protect. The left road leads only to chains gilded with the lie of inevitability." Elias looked from one to the other, then down the two paths. They appeared identical. The same worn stones, the same patient mist, the same promise of eventual arrival at some unspecified destination. Yet he found himself believing that they led to entirely different worlds. "What's the difference?" he asked. Brother Destiny smiled with serene certainty. "The left path is the way of acceptance. Every step you take has been written in the book of existence since before time began. You will face no uncertainty because your journey is already complete. You need only walk through it. Every sorrow has meaning, every joy is earned, every choice is the only choice you could have made. There is profound peace in surrendering to the pattern that contains you." Brother Freedom shook his head, his own smile carrying a different quality, wilder, more dangerous, shot through with the exhilaration of standing at the edge of a cliff. "The left path is the way of delusion," he said. "My brother offers you the comfort of being a character in someone else's story. But the right path is where you become the author. Every step is yours to choose, every mistake yours to make, every triumph yours to claim. You will know uncertainty, yes, but you will also know the terrible, beautiful weight of true responsibility. Freedom is terrifying, but it is real." "They're both lies," Brother Destiny said calmly. "Freedom is the cruelest illusion. You cannot choose what you do not know, and you cannot know what has not yet been determined. My brother offers you the anxiety of believing you are in control, but control is suffering." "Destiny is the cruelest lie," Brother Freedom replied with equal composure. "If all is predetermined, then consciousness is meaningless, love is mechanical, and growth is impossible. My brother offers you the false peace of believing your choices don't matter, but choice is the only thing that makes existence valuable." Elias sat down on the road between them, pulling his knees to his chest like a child trying to make himself small enough to disappear. The compass lay open in his palm, its needle still vibrating between the two paths with increasing agitation. "How do I know which of you is telling the truth?" he asked. "You don't," said Brother Destiny. "You can't," said Brother Freedom. "Then how do I choose?" "You don't choose," said Brother Destiny. "Choice is an illusion. You will take the path you are always going to take, and believing otherwise only causes suffering." "You must choose," said Brother Freedom. "Choice is the fundamental act of existence. To refuse to choose is to choose non-being, and that is the only true error." Elias closed his eyes and tried to feel his way toward an answer, but the harder he reached for certainty, the more it slipped away from him like water through cupped fingers. Both monks spoke with equal conviction, equal wisdom, equal compassion. Both paths looked equally real, equally promising, equally treacherous. When he opened his eyes, he was looking not at the paths but at the space between them, a narrow strip of wild grass that grew along the fork's edge, leading neither left nor right but straight ahead into a tangle of stunted trees and uncertain ground. "What if you're both right?" he said suddenly. "What if you're both wrong?" The monks looked at him with expressions of polite confusion. "There are only two paths," Brother Destiny said gently. "The choice is binary," Brother Freedom agreed. "Destiny or freedom, acceptance or responsibility. There is no third option." But Elias was already standing, already moving toward the wild space between the established paths. The grass was taller than it had appeared from the road, reaching nearly to his waist, and it whispered secrets in languages he didn't recognize as he pushed through it. "Perhaps the choice isn't between your two truths," he called back to the monks. "Perhaps it's between accepting that someone else has defined my options and deciding that the menu is incomplete." Behind him, he heard Brother Destiny say, "He will learn. The pathless way leads only to suffering." And Brother Freedom replied, "He will learn. The pathless way leads only to chaos." But their voices were already growing distant, muffled by the increasing thickness of the strange forest that grew in the space between certainties. Elias pushed deeper into the trees, following no path but the one his footsteps created, guided only by the compass that had finally stopped its frantic vibration and now pointed steadily ahead. Not north, not south, but towards something that had no name in any language he knew. The trees grew closer together as he walked, their branches interweaving overhead until they blocked out the grey sky entirely. Yet somehow there was still light, not sunlight or moonlight, but something more fundamental, as if illumination were simply a property of being, rather than something that came from external sources. The air grew warmer, carrying scents of flowers that bloomed in no earthly season, and spices that belonged to feasts he had never attended. Gradually the forest thinned, and Elias found himself standing at the edge of something impossible, a city that rose from the wilderness like a fever dream made manifest. Its buildings were constructed from materials that shouldn't have existed, stone that flowed like water, glass that rang like bells when the wind touched it, metal that shifted colour with each heartbeat. The architecture followed no earthly tradition, yet it felt familiar in the way that home feels familiar even when you've never seen it before. The strangest thing about the city was not its impossible beauty, but its emptiness. Streets wide enough for celebration parades stood vacant. Windows that should have framed domestic scenes remained dark. Fountains carved from single pieces of crystal sang with the voices of running water, but no one gathered to listen. Yet the city was not dead. It hummed with potential energy, like a theatre moments before the curtain rises. The air itself seemed expectant, waiting for something to begin or someone to arrive. And as Elias walked through the gates, massive portals that opened without his touch, as if recognizing his approach, he began to hear voices. They were quiet at first, barely more than whispers carried on wind that touched nothing else. But as he moved deeper into the city, walking down streets paved with stones that chimed softly under his feet, the voices grew clearer. They came from everywhere and nowhere, from windows, from doorways, from the spaces between buildings where shadows gathered like pools of liquid darkness. And every voice was asking questions. Who decides what beauty means? Drifted from a tower whose walls were covered in murals that shifted and changed as he watched. Is love what we feel or what we do? Whispered from a garden where flowers bloomed in colours that had no names. When does a path become a destination? Echoed from an alley that seemed to stretch infinitely inward. Why do we call it falling when we rise in love? Sang from a bridge that spanned nothing but air. Elias tried to respond, to offer answers, or at least opinions, but every time he opened his mouth the voices grew louder, more insistent, drowning out his attempts at speech with cascades of inquiry that seemed to generate more questions even as they were asked. What is the sound of yesterday remembering? Can truth exist without someone to believe it? Is the dreamer dreaming the dream? Or is the dream dreaming the dreamer? Where does the river go when it reaches the sea? The questions were beautiful and terrible, profound and playful, urgent and eternal. They washed over Elias like waves, each one carrying him further from the solid ground of certainty he had once stood on. He found himself turning in circles, trying to locate the sources of the voices, but they seemed to emanate from the very air, from the buildings themselves, from the spaces between his own thoughts. What makes a moment immortal? Is silence the absence of sound, or the presence of listening? Do we find meaning, or does meaning find us? When does the seeker become the sought? Hours passed, or perhaps time had given up its linear pretensions and decided to flow in spirals instead. Elias wandered the questioning city, growing increasingly desperate to contribute something, anything, to the endless dialogue that surrounded him. But every attempt to speak was met with new questions that rendered his answers irrelevant before they could be born. Finally, exhausted by the effort of trying to respond to the unanswerable, Elias sat down in the middle of a square where fountains made music from falling water and buildings hummed with architectural harmony. The questions continued to swirl around him, but he no longer tried to catch them with words. Instead, he simply listened. And in listening, he began to notice something remarkable. The questions were not seeking answers. They were celebrating their own existence. Each inquiry was complete in itself, perfect in its uncertainty, beautiful precisely because it opened rather than closed, because it created space rather than filling it. "What is the colour of wonder?" sang past his ear, and instead of trying to name it, Elias simply smiled. "Where does laughter go when the joke is over?" whispered from a nearby doorway, and instead of explaining, he let the question dance. Slowly, experimentally, Elias opened his mouth not to answer but to ask, "What would happen if I stopped needing to know?" The effect was immediate and profound. The city's voices rose in harmony, as if his question had provided the missing note in a vast eternal chord. The buildings themselves seemed to brighten, their impossible materials glowing with renewed life. And in that moment of perfect questioning, Elias felt something shift inside him. Not the satisfaction of finding an answer, but the deeper peace of learning to love the search itself. But even as he basked in this revelation, he noticed something else. Cracks were appearing in the walls around him, hair-thin at first, then growing wider, spreading through the crystal and flowing stone like lightning frozen in reverse. The sound of the fountains grew discordant, and the air itself began to shimmer as if reality were having second thoughts about its construction project. "What is happening?" Elias asked. But his words came out as whispers rather than questions, and the city's harmony faltered. That was when he understood. The city could only exist in the space of pure inquiry. The moment someone tried to understand what was happening rather than simply experiencing it, the spell broke. The beautiful impossibility could only sustain itself as long as its inhabitants remained content to question without grasping for answers. But understanding was not the same as explaining, and knowing was different from controlling. As the cracks spread faster through the questioning city, Elias found himself faced with a choice that the twin monks had not included in their binary options. He could try to save the city by forcing himself back into pure questioning, or he could let it crumble and see what lay beneath. He chose the crumble. The city collapsed not with violence but with a sound like sighs, as if its buildings were exhaling themselves back into the dream space from which they had emerged. But as the last tower dissolved into mist and memory, Elias saw that the dissolution had revealed something that had been there all along. A doorway set into the ground itself, its frame made from the same material as the road he had been travelling. The doorway opened onto stairs that descended into warm golden light. Without hesitation, because hesitation would have been another form of trying to understand rather than simply moving forward, Elias stepped through and began to descend. The stairs were countless but not tiresome, each step carrying him not just downward but inward, towards something that felt like the centre of existence itself. The golden light grew stronger as he descended, and with it came the scent of old books and ancient wisdom, of stories that had been told so many times they had become true through sheer repetition. At the bottom of the stairs, Elias found himself in a library that challenged every assumption he had made about space and possibility. The shelves stretched upward beyond sight, downward beyond comprehension, and outward in directions that geometry had never named. Books filled every available space, not just on shelves but floating in the air, orbiting each other like literary planets, forming constellations of knowledge that pulsed with their own inner light. This was not just a library, but the library, the repository of every belief system that had ever been embraced by any conscious being anywhere in the vast tapestry of existence. Here were the creation myths of civilizations that had never evolved past single-celled organisms, but had somehow dreamed themselves into being anyway. Here were the philosophical treatises of gas giants that achieved consciousness through atmospheric pressure and wind patterns. Here were the love songs of mathematical equations that had fallen in love with their own solutions. Every book was different, yet they were all connected by invisible threads of meaning that wove through the library like a vast web of understanding. Some books were massive tomes bound in materials that came from the hearts of dying stars. Others were simple pamphlets written on what appeared to be ordinary paper, but which contained truths that could reshape reality if read with sufficient attention. Some were not books at all, but crystalline structures that stored information in their molecular arrangements, or wisps of cloud that held knowledge in the patterns of their ever-changing forms. Elias walked among the shelves in wonder, occasionally reaching out to touch a spine or open a cover. Each book he examined contained a complete worldview, a way of understanding existence that was internally consistent and utterly convincing while you were reading it. Here was a philosophy based on the idea that all of reality was the dream of a sleeping god who would wake up if anyone ever figured out the nature of existence. And the book was written as a desperate attempt to keep everyone confused for the sake of universal survival. Here was a treatise on the mathematics of emotion, proving conclusively that love was simply the universe's way of preventing entropy through strategic distribution of caring. Some of the books contradicted each other so fundamentally that they should have annihilated each other through pure logical incompatibility. Yet they coexisted peacefully, each secure in its own truth, each offering its own path through the maze of being. It was as if the library existed in a space beyond argument, where contradiction was not a problem to be solved but a feature to be celebrated. As Elias wandered deeper into the stacks, following paths that seemed to rearrange themselves to accommodate his curiosity, he began to notice that some books were calling to him more strongly than others. Not with voices. The library was profoundly silent, as if sound would be an intrusion on the sacred work of preservation, but with a kind of gravitational pull that drew his attention like iron filings toward a magnet. One book in particular seemed to glow more brightly as he approached. It was bound in leather that felt familiar under his fingertips, and when he opened it to the first page he saw his own handwriting looking back at him. The book was his life story, but not the life he remembered living. This was the story of an Elias who had never awakened beside the endless road, who had never encountered the mirror merchant or the questioning city. This Elias had lived a full, rich existence in a world much like the one reflected in the merchant's mirrors. He'd fallen in love, raised children, built things that mattered, grown old in the company of people who knew his name and loved him for reasons that made sense. The writing was undeniably his. He recognized the peculiar slant of his handwriting, the way he crossed his T's and looped his G's. But more than that, he recognized the voice, the particular rhythm of thought that shaped the sentences. This was his story, written in his hand, describing a life he had never lived but which felt more real than the strange journey that had brought him to this library of impossible beliefs. As he read, Elias found himself sinking into the life described in the book. He could taste the coffee his other self had drunk on quiet Sunday mornings. He could feel the weight of his children as they fell asleep in his arms. He could smell the sawdust in the workshop where he had crafted furniture with his hands, creating beauty from raw wood and patient attention. It was a good life, full of small joys and manageable sorrows, marked by the kind of meaning that comes from connection rather than revelation. The book was thick, hundreds of pages describing decades of experience. But as Elias read, he realized something that made his hands tremble. The story was written in past tense, but it described events that were still in his future. According to the narrative, he would leave this library, find his way back to something resembling the ordinary world, and live the life detailed in the pages. Every choice was laid out, every consequence described, every moment of happiness and sorrow catalogued with the precision of someone who had already experienced it all. At the end of the book, the other Elias died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, surrounded by grandchildren who would remember him as a man who had always seemed to know exactly who he was and where he belonged. It was, by any reasonable measure, a perfect conclusion to a well-lived life. But it was also a trap. Elias understood with sudden clarity that if he continued reading, if he absorbed all the details of this predetermined existence, he would begin to live it. Not because he was forced to, but because knowing the shape of something made it easier to fall into that shape than to resist it. The book offered him certainty, identity, purpose, all the things he'd been searching for since he had awakened beside the endless road. All he had to do was accept that his searching was over, that the answer had been here all along, waiting for him to find it. He could close the book now and walk away, but he would always know it was here. He could try to forget what he had read, but the memory of that other life would colour every experience he had going forward. Or he could finish reading and surrender to the comfort of living a story that had already been written by someone who understood the human heart well enough to craft a perfect life. There was a third option, of course. He could destroy the book, burn away the predetermined path and force himself to continue improvising his existence moment by moment. But destroying it felt like vandalism of the worst kind, an act of violence against possibility itself. The book was beautiful after all. The life it described was genuinely good. Who was he to say that a perfect predetermined existence was inferior to the messy uncertainty of self-creation? Elias sat in the golden light of the impossible library, holding his own future in his hands, paralysed by the weight of choosing not just what to do, but who to become. Around him, millions of other belief systems hummed with their own certainties, each one offering its own solution to the problem of existence, each one true within its own carefully constructed boundaries. Time passed, or perhaps time simply waited, recognizing that some decisions existed outside the normal flow of chronology. Finally, Elias closed the book without reading further and set it gently back on its shelf. Not because he rejected the life it offered, but because choosing it felt like choosing to stop being curious about what other lives were possible. The moment the book left his hands, the library began to change around him. Not collapsing like the questioning city, but transforming, its impossible architecture rearranging itself to accommodate his choice. New paths opened between the shelves, leading not to other books but to doorways that opened onto landscapes he had never imagined. The golden light grew brighter, more welcoming, and Elias understood that by refusing to be contained by any single story, even a perfect one, he had somehow earned the right to explore all of them. He walked toward the nearest doorway, drawn by the scent of rain and the sound of wind chimes. But just before he stepped through, he heard footsteps behind him and turned to see another figure approaching through the stacks. The man looked exactly like Elias, but older, perhaps by 20 years, perhaps by centuries. His hair was silver where Elias's was brown, his face marked by lines that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure. He moved with the careful grace of someone who had learned to carry the weight of many experiences without being crushed by them. "You didn't read the book?" the older Elias said. It wasn't a question. "No," Elias replied. "Did you think I would?" "I hoped you wouldn't. But hope and expectation are different creatures, and I've learned not to confuse them." They stood facing each other in the golden light, two versions of the same person separated by time and choice and the accumulated weight of different decisions. The older Elias looked around the library with the fond familiarity of someone returning to a childhood home. "This is where it starts," he said, "or where it ends, depending on how you look at it. The library exists at the crossing point between all possible lives. Every version of yourself that could ever exist passes through here eventually." "Are you me?" Elias asked. "From the future, I mean?" The older man smiled, and in that smile Elias recognized something he had seen in the mirror merchant's reflections, the expression of someone who had found peace not by resolving all questions, but by learning to live comfortably with uncertainty. "I'm a you," he said, "one of many, the one who read the book as it happens. I lived that perfect life, died surrounded by love, and found myself here afterward, wondering if perfection was really what I'd been searching for all along. And was it? It was perfect," the older Elias said, "but perfect isn't the same as real. Real includes the possibility of imperfection, of surprise, of growing into something you never planned to become. Perfect is beautiful, but it's also finished, and I found that I wasn't ready to be finished." They walked together toward the doorway that had called to Elias, their footsteps echoing strangely in the vast space of accumulated wisdom. As they approached the threshold, Elias could see that it opened onto a narrow bridge that spanned what appeared to be an infinite abyss. On the other side of the bridge, he could just make out another landscape, not the barren hills where his journey had begun, but something greener, more alive, shot through with possibilities he couldn't yet name. "Where does it lead?" he asked. "Everywhere," the older Elias replied. Nowhere. Forward. The bridge connects all the places you've been to all the places you might go. But you have to cross it alone. That's the rule. Each person's bridge is different, and sharing the weight would collapse the span. Elias looked at the bridge, narrow, made from the same material as the endless road, stretching across emptiness toward uncertainty. It should have been terrifying, but instead he felt the familiar warmth of the compass in his pocket, still pointing steadily towards something that had no name but which felt increasingly like home. "Will I see you again?" he asked the older version of himself. "Probably not," the other replied, "but you'll see other versions of me, and I'll see other versions of you. That's how it works when you refuse to be contained by a single story. The universe becomes infinitely more generous with its possibilities." Elias stepped onto the bridge. It held his weight easily, though he could feel it swaying slightly in the wind that rose from the abyss below. Behind him, the library continued its eternal work of preservation and possibility. Ahead, the landscape beckoned with the promise of new questions and undiscovered truths. Halfway across the bridge, he stopped and turned back to call out to his older self, "Was it worth it?" Choosing uncertainty over perfection. But the older Elias was already gone, dissolved back into the library of infinite beliefs, like a memory that had served its purpose and was ready to become something else. Elias was alone on the bridge, suspended between the wisdom he was leaving behind and the mystery he was walking toward. The realization should have been lonely, but instead it felt like the most honest moment of his journey so far. He was exactly where he belonged, between certainties, above the abyss of not knowing, walking forward not because he knew where he was going, but because moving forward was the most authentic response he could make to the gift of existence. The far side of the bridge welcomed him with the scent of growing things and the sound of water flowing over stones. As his feet touched solid ground again, Elias felt something shift in his chest. Not the settling sensation of arrival, but the opening feeling of beginning. The landscape that spread before him was unlike anything he had encountered on his journey. Where the endless road had cut through barren hills and patient mist, this place pulsed with life that seemed to recognize his presence. Trees leaned toward him as he passed, their leaves whispering in languages that sounded almost familiar. Flowers turned to follow his movement like curious children. Even the stones beneath his feet seemed to hum with quiet welcome. But it was not paradise, or rather, it was paradise the way paradise should be, which is to say, complicated. Beauty existed here alongside shadow, growth alongside decay, joy woven inextricably with sorrow. A tree heavy with fruit cast its shade over bones that had been weathered smooth by time and rain. A stream sang with crystalline joy as it carried away the detritus of seasons past. It was a place where nothing was hidden, where every truth was allowed to coexist with its contradiction. Elias walked through this landscape of honest complexity for what felt like hours, though time continued to behave strangely, stretching and compressing like taffy in the hands of an enthusiastic child. The compass in his pocket had grown quiet, its needle pointing steadily forward, but without the urgent vibration that had marked his earlier journey. It seemed less concerned with destination now, more interested in simply confirming that forward existed, and that forward was where he belonged. As the quality of light began to change, not dimming exactly, but deepening like water becoming wine, Elias found himself approaching something that made him stop and stare. It was a mirror, but not like the ones the old woman had sold beside the endless road. This mirror was enormous, easily 20 feet tall and half as wide, framed not in wood or metal, but in living stone that pulsed with its own heartbeat. And it reflected nothing. Or rather, it reflected everything that wasn't there. The space around him, the landscape behind him, the sky above him, but not Elias himself. Where his reflection should have been stood empty air, an Elias-shaped absence in the world's reflection. He approached cautiously, remembering the shattering of the merchant's mirror and the infinite recursion he had glimpsed in its fragments. But this mirror felt different. It didn't promise revelation or threaten dissolution. It simply offered a question without words. What are you when you are not the sum of what others see? Elias reached out to touch the mirror's surface and found that his hand passed through it like water, like mist, like the memory of touching. The mirror was not a barrier but a doorway, and the landscape on the other side, the one that reflected everything except him, was the same landscape he stood in, but somehow more real, more vivid, more itself. He stepped through. The sensation was indescribable, not like moving from one place to another, but like moving from one way of being to another. On this side of the mirror he could still see his hands, still feel his feet against the ground, still hear his heartbeat and taste his breath. But something fundamental had changed. He was present without being visible, existing without being reflected, participating in the world without leaving tracks in its memory. It was terrifying and liberating in equal measure. To exist without being witnessed felt like the ultimate loneliness, but it also felt like the ultimate freedom. He could be anyone here, or no one. He could try on different ways of moving through the world without worrying about whether they suited the person others expected him to be. As he walked through this reflected landscape, Elias began to notice other figures moving through the scenery. At first he thought they might be other travellers who had found their way through their own mirrors, but as he drew closer to the first one, he realised something extraordinary. It was himself, but not himself. Another version of Elias, one who moved with confidence born of certainty, who looked around the landscape as if he owned it, who radiated the kind of self-assurance that comes from never having doubted one's place in the world. This confident Elias was followed by others, a timid Elias who flinched at shadows and started at unexpected sounds, an angry Elias whose hands were clenched into fists and whose jaw was set against some invisible injustice, a laughing Elias who seemed to find the entire universe hilariously absurd, a weeping Elias who carried sorrow like a sacred burden, a dancing Elias who moved as if the ground beneath his feet were made of music. They were all him, but they were also all separate from him, living out the versions of himself that existed in potential, that had been pruned away by the choices he had made or failed to make. And they couldn't see him, just as he couldn't see himself in the great mirror. He was the observer now, the witness to his own multiplicity. The strangest part was that they were all real, not figments or fantasies, but actual versions of himself that existed in the spaces between choice and consequence. The confident Elias was really confident, the angry Elias was genuinely furious, the dancing Elias moved with authentic joy. They were complete people, not aspects or fragments, and they were living full lives in this reflected realm, where being invisible to the primary world meant being fully visible to each other. Elias watched them for a long time, learning things about himself he had never suspected. The angry version of him was furious not at the world, but at his own tendency toward passivity, and his anger was driving him to create things of startling beauty. Sculptures carved from crystallized rage that somehow communicated profound gentleness. The timid version had learned to see wonders that boldness would have overlooked, and he moved through the landscape like a living prayer, blessing everything he touched with careful attention. Even the weeping Elias carried his sorrow like a musician carries a song, transforming pain into something that could be shared and thereby diminished. But watching them also filled him with a strange longing. These other versions of himself were more definite than he was, more committed to their particular ways of being. They had chosen to be one thing fully rather than remaining open to all possibilities, and there was a kind of peace in that commitment that he envied. As if summoned by his longing, one of the other Eliases, the dancing one, suddenly stopped mid-step and looked directly at him. For a moment their eyes met across the impossible divide between visible and invisible, and the dancing Elias smiled with recognition, and something that might have been pity. "You can see me," Elias said, though he hadn't intended to speak. "Of course I can see you," the dancing Elias replied, his voice carrying the rhythm of perpetual motion. "You're the one who refuses to choose. You're always visible to us because you're always becoming us moment by moment, before shying away at the last second. Is that wrong?" "It's not wrong or right," the dancing Elias said, executing a small pirouette that somehow managed to be both graceful and slightly mocking. "It's just incomplete. You keep trying to be everything instead of choosing to be something. But everything includes nothing, and nothing is a cold place to live." "But if I choose to be one thing, I lose all the others," Elias protested. "Yes," said the dancing Elias, and now his movement slowed, became more like swaying, more like the motion of trees in wind. "That's what choosing means. That's what living means. You sacrifice the infinite for the specific. the possible for the actual. It's the most generous thing consciousness can do, to limit itself so that something definite can exist. But which one should I choose? The dancing Elias laughed, a sound like wind chimes in a hurricane. That's the wrong question. The question isn't which one you should choose. The question is which one you're brave enough to choose. Which one you're willing to become fully, knowing that all the others will become roads not travelled. Around them, the other versions of Elias had stopped their various activities and were watching this conversation with expressions of curious interest. The angry one leaned on his latest sculpture. The timid one peered out from behind a tree. The confident one stood with arms crossed and a knowing smile. Even the weeping one had paused in his tears to listen. "What if I choose wrong?" Elias asked. "Then you'll be wrong," said the confident Elias, stepping forward. "Magnificently, completely, authentically wrong. And being wrong is infinitely more interesting than being nothing." "What if I choose something that hurts others?" Elias asked. "Then you'll learn about pain," said the weeping Elias, his voice thick with compassion. "And learning about pain is how you learn about love. They're the same curriculum, taught in different classrooms." "What if I choose something and then want to change?" asked Elias. "Then you'll change," said the dancing Elias, spinning again. "Choosing to be something doesn't mean choosing to be that thing forever. It means choosing to be that thing fully for now, until it's time to choose again." Elias looked around at all these versions of himself, each one complete in their chosen incompleteness, each one real in their willingness to be defined. They were offering him something he had been avoiding throughout his entire journey, the gift of limitation, of being bounded, of existing within constraints that would make existence meaningful, precisely because it was not infinite. But even as he understood this, he felt the familiar urge to step back, to keep his options open, to remain in the space between choices where all possibilities coexisted. It was comfortable there, in the undefined territory where he could be anyone because he wasn't committed to being anyone in particular. "I don't know how to choose," he admitted. "Yes, you do," said all the other versions of himself in unison, their voices creating a harmony that was both beautiful and slightly unsettling. "You've been choosing all along. You chose to walk the road instead of staying put. You chose to create your own path instead of taking the ones the monks offered. You chose to let the city crumble instead of preserving it. You chose to leave the book unread instead of accepting the perfect life it promised. You've been choosing to remain unchosen, and that's a choice too." The truth of this hit him like cold water. He had been making choices, but he had been making the same choice over and over again. The choice to defer choosing, to remain open, to exist in potential rather than actuality. And that choice was beginning to feel less like wisdom and more like cowardice. "What happens if I choose?" he asked. "You become real," said the dancing Elias. "Not more real than you are now, but real in a different way. Real in the way that rivers are real because they flow in particular directions. Real in the way that songs are real because they happen in time. Real in the way that lives are real because they have beginnings and middles and ends." Elias closed his eyes and tried to feel his way toward a decision. But instead of grasping for an answer, he let himself simply be present with the question. He thought about the compass in his pocket, which had stopped pointing everywhere and had learned to point somewhere. He thought about the endless road, which was infinite but still had to be travelled one step at a time. He thought about the mirrors that had shown him possibilities, and the library that had preserved all beliefs, and the city that had celebrated questions without needing to answer them. When he opened his eyes, he was alone in the reflected landscape. The other versions of himself had vanished, but he understood that they hadn't gone anywhere. They were still there, still available, still possible. But now they were waiting for him to choose which one to become, at least for now, at least until the next choice arose. And in that moment of solitude, surrounded by a world that reflected everything except himself, Elias finally understood what he had been searching for since he awakened beside the endless road. He hadn't been looking for truth or meaning or purpose, though he had encountered all of these things. He had been looking for the courage to be someone instead of anyone, something instead of everything, here instead of everywhere. The choice, when it came, was not dramatic. He simply took a step forward, but this time he took it as himself, not as the person he might become or should become or could become, but as the person he was willing to be right now in this moment, with all his uncertainty and incompleteness intact. The moment his foot touched the ground with that intention, the reflected landscape began to shimmer and change. The mirror world wasn't disappearing, but he was passing through it, emerging on the other side into something that was neither the barren landscape of the endless road nor the impossible beauty of the library. It was simply a place, green and ordinary and real, where morning mist was lifting from hills that rolled away toward a horizon that promised nothing more than the quiet satisfaction of being reached by anyone willing to walk toward it. And there, just visible in the distance, was a road, not the endless road of his beginning, but a simple path that wandered through the landscape with the comfortable meandering of something that knew where it was going without being in any particular hurry to get there. Elias pulled out his compass one last time. The needle pointed steadily toward the path, but now he understood that it had always been pointing not toward a destination, but toward the next step, not toward an answer, but toward the next question worth asking. He put the compass away and began to walk, not because he knew where the path would lead, but because walking was what you did with paths, and being someone was what you did with life, and moving forward was what you did with time when you finally stopped being afraid of it running out. Behind him, the great mirror stood empty and patient, ready for the next traveller who needed to see themselves clearly enough to disappear, ready to reflect everything except the one thing that mattered most. The courage to step through uncertainty and into the magnificent, terrible, beautiful business of being specifically and temporarily and completely alive. The mist continued to lift as Elias walked, revealing more of the landscape around him. It was not spectacular. No crystal cities or impossible libraries, no monks offering philosophical puzzles or merchants selling reflections of unlived lives. It was simply a place where things grew and changed and endured and passed away, according to rhythms older than consciousness and more reliable than understanding. And that, Elias realized as his footsteps found their rhythm on the meandering path, was exactly what he had been looking for all along. Not the answer to existence itself, with all its ordinary miracles and necessary limitations, its beautiful brevity and its inexhaustible capacity for surprise. The path stretched ahead of him, not endless but sufficient, not infinite but real, and he walked it, not because he had solved the mystery of being, but because he had finally learned to love the mystery enough to inhabit it fully, one step at a time, with no compass but curiosity, and no destination but the next moment's invitation to continue becoming whoever it was he was brave enough to be. Perhaps the meaning was never at the end. Perhaps the road was meant to be walked, not solved. And perhaps that was not a disappointment but the most generous gift consciousness could offer itself. The opportunity to be present for its own unfolding, to witness its own becoming, to participate in the endless, ordinary, extraordinary business of being here, now, real, and committed to the beautiful uncertainty of what comes next.